Hey, what's up, guys? So it's been an interesting week in the stock market with Trump's tariffs shaking things up. So I thought I'd give my 2 cents on the matter. I think Trump's tariffs are necessary, and I realize it sounds crazy. It's probably not a very common opinion, but at some point the United States needs to do a hard pivot to reorient the world order in a way that's favorable to the United States. A lot of people and their parents and even their grandparents only lived in this Pax Americana, US-led world order, so they don't know any other world. And this is just the default state of the world for them, but empires rise and fall, and it's normal and natural. No one stays on top forever. And the way this works is that if all these countries in the world, their GDP per capita eventually came close to even, which is ideally what you would want in an ideal future, the three most populous countries are India, China, and the United States. And so economists believe we'll live in this multipolar world where those three countries are the centers of power. China knows this, so it's sort of encircled India with what's called the string of pearls. They have these navy bases around India, and it sort of chokes out India's growth potential if they ever go to war or something. And they learn from the best. They learn from the United States, because the United States has China encircled. Since the end of World War II, they understood that China, being communist, being the little brother of Russia, could be a threat, so they set up allies with South Korea, Japan, Guam on the second island chain. They've encircled China as well. And so both countries understand the importance of doing that. What's happening is that the United States allowed outsourcing to happen because, well, the United States is run by the elites, and it was good for the stock market, it was good for corporate profits, it's bad for the middle and lower class, basically globalization. So the United States allowed outsourcing to happen and globalization to happen in order to make more money. And at the same time, it's win-win. It enriches these other countries who need that money from the US to grow their economies. So that's what the United States ended up doing. And it worked while these countries were poor. You know, while China was poor and they weren't a threat to the United States, it made perfect sense for the United States to utilize China for cheap labor. But what ended up happening is that China grew and then turned Africa into their China. And then now China is a competitor to the United States. And the difference is that China also still does manufacturing for the United States. So what we saw during COVID is that the United States is actually quite vulnerable. Things go from a trade war to a Cold War, then a Cold War to a hot war. The United States is quite vulnerable to China because China, during COVID, they kept all the N95 masks. And I don't blame them for doing it. They're the ones who manufacture it. So they just said, yeah, no, we're not fulfilling your order. We're just keeping these for ourselves. We're in a pandemic. And the rest of the world can't do anything about that. Same thing with pharmaceuticals and drugs. China threatened to cut off pharmaceuticals to the United States if the United States didn't stop probing into the origins of COVID. And so the United States basically stopped probing, and no one talks about it anymore. If they made a major mistake there, they owe the world reparations, frankly. For all those people who died and for the economic damage. Like, the world should basically say, hey, you guys messed up badly, and you could have prevented this, or you could have kept it contained within your country, but you decided not to. That was really irresponsible, and we want some level of reparations. The world could behave that way, but it chose not to. But it chose not to for a reason, right? Like, Australia was probing, and China put 80% tariffs on their barley. and they didn't take it off till 3 years later, when the whole origins of COVID conversations already died down and COVID was pretty much gone. And so, is that a coincidence? No, of course not. Everything's deliberate with China. There's no such thing as diplomacy, right? Diplomacy is all about just hard power. It's soft power, which can lead to hard power. So things like the WTO are basically toothless. You can raise your concerns with the WTO and they'll tell you what they think, and then they don't have an enforcement arm. So that, okay, thanks for your opinion, but it doesn't mean anything. Everything just boils down to power. And so, because China has the biggest population, or actually India surpassed China's population, but it's India, China, then the United States. So China has about 4 times the population of the United States. So economic gravity is on their side. Basically, if their GDP per capita reaches a quarter of that of the US, then they'll have the same GDP as the United States because they have 4 times the population. And they can probably do better than that. They can probably at least reach half the GDP per capita of the United States, which means like China will be twice the GDP of the United States. In many ways, it's inevitable that China is going to overtake the United States economically. The question is, what's the US going to do about that? They have different ideologies, and it's not really good for the United States for China to become the most powerful country in the world. So why are tariffs necessary? The United States needs to bring manufacturing back. And I know people are saying, yo, that's so stupid. There's no way an American's going to work for pennies on a factory line. dude, no one's doing that anymore, even in China. All that's automated. So it isn't that they want people in the United States to work on the factory line. They want those Tesla robots to be working on the factory line, but they want it manufactured within the United States. And it's for security reasons. That's also why Trump was bullying TSMC to build that factory in Arizona, because they want a percentage of their chips to be manufactured within the United States. So it's all the same thing. And all of these big geopolitical talking points that Trump is kind of fighting over in news headlines, it all revolves around China, right? So reclaiming the Panama Canal, that's because China was trying to basically buy out the Panama Canal, and the US doesn't want China to have power over something like that in the Americas. And the whole Greenland thing, it isn't just about minerals, it's about shipping lanes and polar ice caps melting. That's going to be a new shipping lane up there. And the United States wants to be able to police that without China and Russia being able to take over that area. So all this stuff, even like the Space Force, right? Trump started the Space Force. It's because with technological improvements, the ability for satellites and, this sounds like crazy, but like lasers to shoot out from like satellites and those being forms of attack, those are all threats now. And so the United States needs to build a Space Force. All this revolves around China. And it isn't just a Trump thing. Like, Biden was actually quite protectionist too. A lot of people don't seem to realize this. Like, when Biden won in 2020, he didn't remove Trump's tariffs, even though he could have, and China asked him to. Because U.S. protectionism is something that's agreed upon on both sides of the aisle. Trump's weapon of choice, the tariff, that's a little bit more of a unique Trump thing, but the idea that the U.S. needs to do its own manufacturing and not be vulnerable to that, Biden was pretty protectionist too. But both sides of the aisle are protectionist, and it's because it makes sense. The world order is changing. All those countries that the U.S. nursed back to health after World War II, they're much stronger now. And so the U.S. shouldn't really be overextending itself trying to take care of them. And they should take care of their own matters. This is just the next phase in world history, and it's pretty much inevitable. There are a couple different ways for how it could go down, but the U.S. needed to make this strategic pivot in its supply chains and how it does things for security reasons. If Trump didn't do this, then the U.S. would slowly have to concede to China's rise. And then once China has power, the U.S. would just be vulnerable to China. So all international treaties between the U.S. and China would just favor China. Economic power would just slowly shift there. So it's either fight this trade war or just concede that China is going to take over. And Trump, I guess, is not a guy that wants to concede in that way. So yeah, he's making the moves that create economic pain for everyone in the world and change the international order to keep the U.S. on top. It's hard for people to follow, but that's pretty much what's happening. And, is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's good for the U.S. So, if you voted for Trump and you're all about America first, yeah, it hurts in your pocketbook, but it is technically good for the U.S. It's bad for the world. A lot of countries have grown dependent on having the U.S. as a trading partner and being able to export their goods to the U.S. So it's gonna hurt those countries quite a bit. So like on average for the world, it's bad. And that's why you see world markets going down. But on average for the U.S., longer term, it's good. Of course, it's bad right now because it's an economic shock that's going to reduce profits by a lot and increase volatility and uncertainty, which is bad for business. And so all of those things reduce profits. And, if China retaliates further and it completely escalates, then on both sides, there's a ton of money that's no longer being made. So as far as the stock market's reaction to it, I think it's a little bit of an overreaction. I mean, within 3 or so days, it lost like 15%. That's pretty insane. That's a more aggressive 3-day move than the worst part of COVID or the worst part of the 2008 financial crash. That's one of the worst 3-day moves I've ever seen. So, you have to ask yourself, is Trump putting these reciprocal tariffs on all these countries, is that a bigger economic shock than the pandemic or 2008 financial crash? No, I don't think so. Especially because it's just a man-made crash. Trump can just reverse it at any time. So, yeah, I mean, the uncertainty he brought out in saying he's going to do that, a lot of that is irreversible. The reputational damage, the broken trust. These intangibles do have business implications. So it is true that even if he just reverses course right now, we wouldn't see a V-shaped correction where the market would just say, oh, okay, that was a bluff. Because all of that uncertainty definitely is going to reduce investment into American companies because people don't know what's going to happen next. So they're kind of sitting on their hands They're not feeling like taking risk when the economic landscape might just change underneath them as they start deploying capital. So yeah, even if Trump just said, just kidding, that was an April Fool's joke, we're doing no tariffs, the market wouldn't bounce back and it would maybe come back like halfway or something. This is where we are now. And hey, for those of you who dollar cost average, don't forget that we're basically where we were a year ago. That's not that bad. Like, I know it feels scary to lose 15-20% immediately, but people acutely feel losses more severely than gains. It's just a thing about human nature. So when you just talk logically, we are back to where we were a year ago, and at least in the S&P. And so that's not that bad, all things considered. I think when the dust settles, we'll start being range bound around here somewhere, and the VIX will slowly creep down. Maybe a good time to sell vol, because vol's still screaming right now. It's going to be a bumpy ride for sure as these negotiations shake out, but I think that everything will be okay. And whenever you're in the crisis, it always feels crazier than it is. And then later on, when you look back on it, you're like, oh yeah, that happened, And it was like that, especially us millennials, we lived through all of those, right? Pandemic, 2008 crash, dot-com crash. And, here we are. S&P is up like 10,000% from there. So I think that it's important to remember that. And this will be in the past too, and the S&P will be up from here in a couple years. You don't want to get caught up panicking. That's when you make the worst decisions, and markets take advantage of that. So the Warren Buffett quote comes to mind: be greedy when others are fearful, and be fearful when others are greedy. And that tends to be true in all financial markets. So I'll leave you guys with that.